Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast, where I seek truth in the world's great books. I'm your host, Eric Rostad, coming to you from the beautiful Books of Titans studio in Franklin, Tennessee. My goal is to read 200 of the great books over the next 10 years and share what I'm learning. I'll talk a bit about each book, tie ideas together from a variety of genres, and share the one thing I always hope to remember from each of the great books. We'll have a special episode here where I'm going to share some ideas on how to lead a reading group. I just finished leading one. It was a 9-week in-person reading group where we read through the entire Iliad. We would take 3 books each week, so there are 24 books within the Iliad, and we would take 3 a week. So that's 8 weeks, and then the first week we did introductions and just got to know each other before diving into that great epic. I've participated in many reading groups over the years, and I've learned a lot just on things that work, things that don't work, and I've gathered some kind of fun ideas over the years on things that I want to share in this episode. My goal is to actually get you to lead your own group, so I hope that this podcast episode encourages you in that direction. And in fact, at the very end of the episode, I'll suggest a first book to cover as part of a reading group. So the reason I wanted to do this recent one covering the Iliad is that, one, just for the sake of the Iliad, I think that's one of the most important books that you can read. It just sets you up to understand so much more of literature that comes after that. And just having the Iliad in your head will pay huge dividends in your reading life from that point forward. I'm also just very concerned at a general level about declining reading levels, declining reading amounts. Everybody's reading, but they're reading on like a screen, and they're reading quotes or tweets or descriptions on photos. And so our attention spans are really taking the brunt of this new addiction that we all have. And books can really help kick that habit and kind of, I view them as the antidote to a lot of what is harming us today. Just the ability to sit down with a long book, to think about deep ideas, to discuss those ideas with other people. You just look at the harm of people on opposite sides of the spectrum just yelling at each other. But here you can get together and discuss really difficult, fun, amazing ideas and topics together over a book that has stood the test of time. I think that's a really incredible thing, and it's just something I want to build in the area in which I live. So that's why I started mine, and I'm hoping to encourage you to start one in your local area as well. To kick off, though, I want to just share, I'm going to kind of have this episode be in 5 different titles, areas of the first being dispelling myths, the second, how to prepare, the third, tips for facilitating a reading group, number 4, rules to help guide you, and then number 5, what your role is in leading the reading group. So first here, dispelling myths. 1, you do not have to have all the answers. I know I was fearful of starting a reading group. Just, what if I don't know? What if I don't know if somebody asks a question? What if I appear dumb? What if I say things that are just obvious or don't add anything to the discussion? What if we end early because I've run out of questions or things like that? And you have to get all those things out of your mind. You don't need to go in and have all the answers. Your job is actually going to be to facilitate a discussion, not to be the person that has all the answers. You're going to be looking at the book for the answers, not to yourself to have all the answers. And the other myth I want to dispel is that you don't have to have a literature degree or some advanced degree to be able to lead these groups. Just the willingness to learn, the willingness to come to an important text, to read it and to discuss it with other people, that is what you need to get started. So for how to prepare, you got to read the book first. So that's obvious, but here are some tips on what to do while you're reading the book in preparation for leading a reading group. So hopefully this is, a few months or so before you you are starting to lead a group. So you have time to read the book maybe once or multiple times if it's a short enough book. But one idea is just to use different color markers or pens as you're reading the book. And so the first time you read that book, maybe select black as the color that you're writing notes and underlining. The second time you read it, choose blue or some other color. That will help you to note the ideas that you or just your observations as you come across them. Because one of the things that's going to be very helpful as you're leading this group is just to share those observations. And you're going to hear some of the same observations that you've had. You'll hear those from others. And then that even helps you just know, like, yeah, I thought the same thing when I read it the first time. And then, I thought something different the second time. But just as you're reading through it, just mark up the book. Don't be afraid to mark it up a lot, write notes in it, write all over the book. But if you do read it multiple times, use different color pens or whatever you use in your books, just use different color something to help you distinguish between the different times that you've read the book. A few other ideas just on preparation is to find podcast episodes that have covered that book. I used some podcast episodes. I will share those in the notes for the show notes. And then those episodes helped me a ton. So I've read like in this particular one I just read, I read the Iliad, and then I read it a second time. And then that's when I decided, I'd really like to lead a group on this. So I read it a third time as we were going through the book. So we covered 3 books a week. I would read those 3 books. Then I would listen to podcast episodes about those books. And then I would look at guides. And so that's my third thing, is just to find a guide that you can use to go through. There's a ton of great guides online that even have questions that you can ask as part of that group. So again, I'll link to one in the show notes for the Iliad, but you could just go in and just read through those questions and that be your guide. So back to that first thing of dispelling myths, you don't have to have all the answers. There are a ton of tools out there to help you to prepare and to facilitate a reading group. So you've got dispelling myths, how to prepare. Now I want to get into just how to facilitate the reading group. And the first thing you got to do is to set expectations. For the Iliad one, I set high expectations. I told people it was going to be hard. I told them that it was going to be time consuming, that to read 3 books of the Iliad each week would take a lot of time. And they might have questions. They might have to read some sections a couple of times to get it. And then I also required an assignment, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But at the very top, I set expectations high and said, please only sign up if you really want to take this on. And you know what? I think that has some reverse psychology aspects to it. Of it actually gets people fired up, and it's a challenge that people want to meet. If you just kind of don't set expectations at the beginning, people may not know what they're getting into. But if you set high expectations, people want to rise to that. They want a challenge. And so just be upfront of what they're about to get into, the time commitment, that sort of thing. And I found that to be very helpful. And it also kind of limits people who may have dropped out anyway. Group size, I suggest limiting it to a specific size or under. So for this recent Iliad one, I wanted to have 20 people, and I knew that would be a lot. But I was going to allow 20 people in, knowing that a few would probably drop out. I was way off on that. First off, I only had 15 or 16 people register, and that was after like a couple months of trying to get people to join the group. So 16 people, and then it quickly dwindled down to like a solid group of 6 or 7 people a week. So even at that 16 people who knew what the expectations were, signed up, maybe even came to that first meeting, it then quickly dwindled down to just a 6 or 7 group. But it was a solid group, and that was actually a very good size because everybody could speak. It wasn't so overwhelming. So just kind of think of the type, the group size that you would like, and just know that probably between 5 and 10, maybe up to 15 is kind of a limit. Otherwise, it just gets to the point where people are not able to share as much. So just think of that going in the group size. I really liked the 6 to 7 people in the group. Require an assignment. This is probably the most crucial piece of advice I could give you into going into a reading group. And part of this comes, I spent a summer at Oxford University in England, and the way their classes are set up is you're in a class. First, it's just 3 people, and then the Oxford Don, the Oxford professor, and each class you have to read like 7 books before you get to class. And then you write a paper, and then one of the students reads the paper, and then students and the professor ask questions about that paper afterwards. But just this idea of you're reading books, but then you're preparing a paper each week. And so I required an assignment for my Iliad reading group, and other reading groups I've been a part of have required this. And so mine, I kept it pretty basic to where you have to write at least one paragraph about the one thing that stood out to you that week. And I was a little nervous. I didn't know how people would take it, if it was going to be too much, but people really liked that part of it, and they did it. And I was surprised. And I would say, it's due at this time, and they would put it in at that time most of the time. And then it just helps. So here are the benefits of doing this. One, it prepares the attendees to come with at least one idea that they've been thinking about. They've thought through it, and they've written it out. So just basics, when they come to that meeting to discuss the books, they've got at least one thing to share. Second, it encourages completing the reading a day before the meeting. So as part of the required assignment, we would meet on Monday nights, and I said the paper is due on Sunday night. And so that was a day before our meeting. And I think one thing, I didn't even think about this beforehand, but I think one thing that did was to encourage people to complete the reading a day before, just so they wouldn't put off the reading until the last day and like, oh crap, we're meeting at 7 p.m. tonight. I got to read through this really quickly. But it actually, you had to finish the reading a day before you actually met. So that was a huge benefit I did not foresee, but it was wonderful. The other thing I did with these papers is I set up a Google shared folder, and that's where you would place these weekly papers. And the idea being that everybody could read everybody else's papers. So that was also fun, because then people would get ideas from other people. They would see what stuck out to them that week. And it just kind of built this camaraderie before we even met, to where you had this paper due, people were reading it, people were seeing what other people were thinking. And this is probably the main thing that I would suggest as part of your group, is to require some sort of an assignment each week. It just really helps get the ball rolling. One, just in terms of facilitating the group, if you are reading a work in a different language, try to use the same translation. And I could go either way on this one. But for the Iliad, I requested that everybody use the same translation. And the main reason is that I had participated in an Iliad reading group, and I actually used a different translation. And for some reason, the numbers on that one did not correspond to the numbers in the one that everyone else was using. And so with these translations, you'll have numbers on the side of like, this is the number line in the epic poem. But the one I was using just did not match up. So if somebody said, hey, I want everybody to look at line 630 in book 6, I would go to mine and it would not be what was in their line 630. So if you can use the same one, it just helps in the discussion, where if you're pointing to an exact a part of the book, then everyone can get there really quickly. On the other hand, it is kind of fun to hear different translations. So we did, even in this group, we had a few other people read different translations. And so I would actually call on them to read their translation every now and then. So you can go either way on that, but just in in assisting with the actual discussion, I found everybody having the same translation to work from is a benefit. As for facilitating the overall group, I would recommend what I did in this last one, where you take the first week and you do not discuss the book at all. You just use that first meeting for everybody to get to know each other. So you allow everybody to introduce themselves, talk about their families, their maybe where they're in school, that kind of thing. Go over those expectations again for the group, and then have some questions ready. Like, have you read this before? Why did you join this group? And just have that first meeting be about that. That just makes the subsequent meetings a lot more enjoyable. People kind of have an idea of who everyone else is, just a very basic, and it just kind of sets things off on the right foot. Now I want to get into some rules that I suggest. The first rule is strongly encourage the participants not to read the introduction before the first meeting. You want to just get right into the work. If people read the introduction of the work, it sets everyone on the same path, or it could, depending on the introduction. But I encouraged everyone, especially with the Iliad, do not read the introduction until you finish the epic, and then go back and read the introduction. So depending on the book you're reading, I would suggest the same as well. Second rule is just no outside influences if possible. So I participated in a reading group in 2004, and it was a continuing education course with Emory University, and we read through the Odyssey, and I was so excited. I had never read Homer. I had wanted to, and here it's Emory University. I'm living in Atlanta at the time. I'm just thrilled to be a part of this. And I get there the first day, and the professor was teaching from Freud, in the sense of let's look at the Odyssey through the lens of Freud. And that is not what I wanted. That's not what the course was billed as. The course was billed as we were reading through the Odyssey. But here, everything had to apply to something that Freud had said, even though it was 2,000 plus years after the Odyssey. And so I missed out a lot on the actual Odyssey and the story, because we're talking so much about Freud. And so in my first, that introduction session that we had, I told everybody, I said, I really do not care what you think about Nietzsche or Freud or whoever else, other authors. We are here to discuss the Iliad. And there will be times where it's appropriate to make another reference, but as much as possible, let's try to just keep it about this book and talk about references within this book. And I broke the rule a number of times in this reading group, but we really did try to do that, of focusing first on this book and not trying to relate it to a bunch of other books, or especially more modern authors. Another thing is, I strongly encourage, we had a few people in the group that had read the epic before, had read the book, had read the Iliad before, and I just begged them, and I would actually cut them off at sometimes, but please do not give away the story. You know the story, no one else here does. They might, even if they know little parts of it, just don't ruin the magic. So I made that a rule of, no, as much as you can, do not give away what's going to happen. I want this to be a magical experience for everybody. Another rule I set at that first meeting was just, there's no idea that's off limits. There are no dumb comments. I want you to come in and just share what you're thinking about this book. And that, that's a fear of mine, of like, what if I share something that's just really stupid? But what I found is, no matter what the idea was that was being shared, even if it was incorrect or it was way off the mark or something, it makes you as the listener come up with a counter argument as to why they're wrong. So even if it's some crazy idea, and you don't want just off the wall ideas the whole time, but you're probably not going to get them. But even if you have a few off the wall ideas, it just encourages everyone else in the group to kind of come up with counter arguments in their heads of why that's not the case. And it actually can lead to some good discussion about the book. So make that clear up front. That's another reason I had mine in person is I just sense that if you do things online, or even if you have a mix of like, all right, we're doing this in person, but we're also going to have a video camera set up, and then people can do it over Zoom as well. There's something about like it being online where there's a fear that it's being recorded, or that it's harder for people just to open up because there's this outside thing kind of looking in at them. It's almost like when you give somebody a microphone, it shuts some people up. Like they just don't want, there's this fear of something being more permanent. Whereas that in-person reading group, it helps things to be a little more intimate and not have this fear of like, gosh, is this being recorded or something like that. The final thing here, I want to just get into the role, like your role if you're the person that is facilitating the reading group. First thing, and this is the most important, you are not the teacher. You're facilitating, but you're not the teacher. The book is the teacher. You've got to pound that in, and you've got to keep that in mind the whole time. Everyone is coming to this book to be the teacher. The author of that book is the teacher. You are not. Everyone is a student, including you. Don't worry about saying dumb things or that kind of thing. In fact, one thing I think about often is in my first job out of college, I was in a meeting, and it was one of the high up executives, and I went into this meeting, and he, whatever was being discussed, he would just ask these questions, and they were really basic questions. And I'm thinking, okay, you're an executive, like, why are you asking these questions? But you know what? Most of the people in that room didn't know the answer to those basic questions. And it helped so much just to see that. It was such a great example, but I've tried to incorporate that in this reading group as well, of just sometimes the basic questions, everyone approaching the book as a student is so helpful, because with that mentality, everyone's coming to learn from the book. No question is too basic or dumb. It kind of helps set that stage. Your role really is to facilitate the discussion. And so even if you know the answer, if you can just ask a question in a way that gets people to think about a particular idea, with a lot of these books, there's just contrast throughout. So you can ask, how did this character compare to this character in this particular part of the book? Another role of yours is to keep everything on track. And so discussions will naturally just kind of veer off a little bit, and it's just your job to kind of keep things moving, keep things going along. One thing I did, so since we were covering 3 books each session in a 2-hour time period, I would take like 30 minutes for each book roughly, and then just 30 minutes for general discussion as well. So I knew once we were getting around the 30-minute mark, it was time to move on to the next book and kind of guide things that way. Then the last thing, as I shared before, you will have read the book before, but do not give away the story. Keep the magic. Your main thing here is you want to approach it with a strong desire to learn. Just get rid of your fears. It's more important to facilitate this reading group than and to overcome your own fears of how everything is going to play out. This could really be a benefit to the people around you, and it'll also be a benefit to you because you're going to hear different ideas about the book. It's going to cause you and help you to think about it in a different way. So the way I want to close out this is to challenge you to start a local reading group, and to start one specifically covering the Iliad. Now, you may have read the Iliad before, you may not have. And so the first step, if you've not read the Iliad, is maybe just to read the Iliad on your own. And this podcast episode, the show notes for this podcast episode will focus heavily on the Iliad. And when I finished on this past Monday, when we finished the Iliad in that reading group, I looked at all the participants and I said, you guys are in a great spot now to read other literature. The Iliad is, along with the Bible, is probably one of the most important books you can read in terms of setting the stage for further reading. just knowing the characters in the Iliad, knowing, so many of things that we say, so many ideas, so many people that we know, like Achilles, Hector, Zeus, this is the starting point. And if you've read the Iliad, then it's easy to move on to the Odyssey. It's easy to move on to the Greek tragedy writers. It's easier to move to Plato and Aristotle, having that foundation in Homer's Iliad. And so I want to strongly encourage you to, if this has sparked a desire for you to lead a reading group, maybe it's even with your own children, maybe it's to try to start one at your local high school or middle school. Try to start it off with the Iliad. If you've read it, great. I would read it again before you get the group going. If you haven't read it, start out. You'll see in the show notes some tools to help you read it, and then also to help you get going with a reading group. I hope this has been helpful, and my main desire is that this encourages you to start a reading group as well. From here, I'm not totally sure yet what I'm doing next, but I think in starting in the new year, 2025, I'm going to try to do one reading group a month. And so we'll meet one Monday a month, perhaps discuss a Greek tragedy. Those are pretty easy to read in about 2 hours. You could read it a couple times before the meeting, but just to go through and continue that practice of facilitating a reading group. I also want to get involved more with youth, and I'm hoping that I can do a reading group on the Iliad at a high school or a college around here as well. I just think it's such an important work, and one that if a student gets it early in life, it will just help them be a better reader. Going through the Iliad just helps you. You have to focus on things. You have to read well. And so it's a great practice, but then just the subject matter, the characters and all that will just set you up for a great life of reading. So the earlier someone can get the Iliad in them, the better. And so that's where I'm going to leave off on this one. Thank you for listening. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you've led reading groups and you have some ideas on ways to facilitate them or share some ideas that I missed, please comment on this podcast episode. That way other people can see it as well. So you just go to Substack, and that's right at booksoftitans.com. And then just find this episode and comment right there. That would be very helpful to anyone else who's looking to start a reading group. If you do start one, please let me know. I'd love to learn about that. You can email me at Eric, ERIK, at booksoftitans.com. I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Books of Titans. Please follow me there. And yeah, keep reading, keep listening, and start your own reading group. I'm out.